I didn't ruin my life by failing. I ruined it by choosing the easier version of myself every time it mattered. That's harder to admit, because it doesn't sound tragic. It doesn't sound like something that deserves sympathy. There was no collapse, no dramatic downfall, no moment where everything burned. Just comfort. Repeated. Carefully. For years. If you had known me then, you would have described me as balanced. Sensible. Someone who had things figured out. I built a life that didn't scare me. One where the risks were manageable, the emotions predictable, and the expectations clear. I thought that was maturity. What it really was avoidance dressed up as wisdom. I remember the first time I noticed it. I was standing at a crossroads, nothing cinematic, just a choice that asked for effort. One path felt uncertain, demanding, emotionally exposed. The other felt familiar and safe. I chose the safe one without hesitation. It felt good. Relieving. Like exhaling after holding my breath. And I told myself, see? That's growth. But that choice wasn't isolated. It became a pattern. Every time life asked me to stretch, to risk embarrassment, to risk being wrong, to risk wanting something more, I reached for the version of myself that required the least resistance. The agreeable one. The practical one. The one who didn't ask too many questions. That version of me was easy to live with. It was also smaller. I didn't notice the shrinking at first. It happens quietly. You don't wake up one day and realize you've abandoned yourself. You just stop arguing when something doesn't sit right. You stop imagining alternatives. You stop feeling disappointed when you settle. You call it acceptance. Years passed like that. I built routines that worked. Relationships that were calm. Goals that were achievable. Everything was reasonable. And nothing felt earned. Sometimes, late at night, I would feel a strange pressure in my chest. Not sadness. Not panic. Something closer to a muted grief. Like standing outside a room where something important was happening, knowing you weren't invited, but also knowing you never knocked. I learned to ignore that feeling. I told myself life wasn't supposed to feel intense all the time. That longing was childish. That people who chased more were reckless, unrealistic, always dissatisfied. I was proud of not needing much. What I didn't understand was that I had trained myself not to want. Opportunities came. Not dramatic ones, just invitations to step forward. To speak up. To try something I hadn't already mastered. Each time, the same internal calculation happened. Is this worth the discomfort? Most of the time, the answer was no. And so I stayed where I was. Where I was competent. Where I was liked. Where I didn't risk looking foolish or failing publicly. The easier version of me thrived there. But the other version, the one who used to imagine a bigger, messier life, grew quiet. I don't remember when I stopped checking in with that part of myself. At some point, its voice became so faint that I mistook the silence for peace. It wasn't peace. It was resignation. The realization hit me much later, in a moment that should have been satisfying. I had achieved something I once thought would make me feel complete. People congratulated me. I smiled, said the right things. And inside, I felt nothing. Not emptiness. Absence. Like something that should have arrived, didn't. That's when the thought appeared, uninvited and devastatingly clear, I chose the life that would cost me the least, and it cost me years. I started looking back, not for mistakes, but for moments where I had opted out of myself. Moments where I chose to be comfortable instead of honest. Safe instead of curious. Adequate instead of alive. There were so many of them. None of them dramatic enough to regret on their own. Together, they formed a life I didn't recognize as mine anymore. I wasn't unhappy. I was underlived. And the most painful part was knowing there was no one to blame. No circumstance. No person. No tragedy. Just a series of small, reasonable choices that slowly erased the parts of me that wanted more. That night, sitting alone, I understood something that shook me more than any failure ever could. I hadn't lost my way. I had chosen away from it. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every memory reorganized itself around that realization. Moments I once considered neutral suddenly carried weight. Conversations I brushed off now sounded like invitations I never accepted. I had always thought regret came from doing the wrong thing. I was wrong. Regret also comes from doing the easy thing for too long. I started noticing how deeply the easier version of myself had shaped my identity. It wasn't just about choices, it was about posture. The way I spoke. The way I listened. The way I reacted when something unsettled me. I had become skilled at smoothing edges. If a conversation grew uncomfortable, I redirected it. If a relationship required vulnerability, I maintained pleasant distance. If a dream demanded uncertainty, I reframed it as unrealistic. I didn't shut doors. I let them close quietly. People around me saw consistency. Reliability. Calm. They didn't see the negotiation happening inside my head every time I chose predictability over curiosity. They didn't see how often I swallowed questions because asking them would have required change. I told myself I was being realistic. But realism, when overused, becomes a cage. The strangest part was how much praise I received for this version of myself. I was told I was grounded. Sensible. Easy to work with. Easy to be around. Easy. That word followed me everywhere. And slowly, I realized something unsettling. I had optimized my life to be easy for everyone, including myself. Easy conversations. Easy expectations. Easy days that blended into each other without friction. But ease has a hidden cost. It doesn't challenge you. It doesn't sharpen you. It doesn't demand that you grow beyond who you already are. I began to feel a dull frustration with myself that I couldn't explain to anyone else. On the surface, my life made sense. Underneath, I felt like I had skipped entire chapters without noticing. There were moments when the harder version of me tried to resurface. A thought. An impulse. A quiet urge to disrupt the pattern. And immediately, the easier version would respond. Why complicate things? Why risk what's already working? Why invite discomfort when you're finally stable? Those arguments always won. Until they didn't. The breaking point didn't come as a crisis. It came as exhaustion. One evening, I caught myself giving advice to someone younger, encouraging them to take a risk I had never taken myself. As I spoke, I heard the emptiness behind my words. I didn't believe what I was saying. I realized then how dangerous it is to let your life become something you can explain but not feel. I had explanations for everything. I had reasons. I had logic. What I didn't have anymore was desire. That night, alone, I tried to remember the last time I chose something because I wanted it, not because it was safe, approved, or reasonable. The memory was distant. And that terrified me. Because it meant the easier version of me hadn't just guided my choices. It had replaced me. I started to understand that choosing ease isn't neutral. It shapes you. It teaches you what parts of yourself are allowed to exist and which ones should stay quiet. Over time, I had trained myself to ignore discomfort, and with it, curiosity, ambition, even joy. The realization hurt in a specific way. Not sharp. Heavy. I wasn't grieving a lost opportunity. I was grieving a lost capacity. The capacity to want without immediately dismissing myself. I looked at my life and saw stability built on compromise after compromise. None of them fatal. All of them cumulative. And I understood something I hadn't before. Comfort doesn't steal your life all at once. It waits until you're too tired to notice it's been taking pieces. That was when the fear finally arrived, not fear of change, but fear of staying exactly as I was. Of waking up years later as an even more refined, even more acceptable, even more distant version of myself. The easier version of me had given me safety. But it had also given me a life that felt unfinished. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped choosing ease, not dramatically, not recklessly, but deliberately. What would remain of me if I stopped defaulting to the smallest version of myself? The question didn't ask me to burn my life down. That's what surprised me. I had always imagined change as something violent, dramatic decisions, irreversible moves, loud declarations. But what I was facing was quieter and far more personal. What would remain of me if I stopped choosing the easier version of myself? At first, the answer was nothing concrete. Just fear. Fear of friction. Fear of disappointing people who liked me manageable. Fear of stepping into situations where competence wasn't guaranteed. But beneath that fear, something else stirred. Curiosity. It had been so long since I allowed myself to feel curious without immediately neutralizing it that the sensation felt almost unfamiliar. Like a muscle waking up after years of disuse. I started small. Painfully small. I spoke when I would normally stay silent. I asked questions I already suspected would complicate things. I admitted uncertainty instead of masking it with confidence. Each act felt disproportionately difficult. But each one felt real. The easier version of me protested constantly. It reminded me how smooth things used to be. How little effort it took to be liked. How efficient life felt when I stayed within my well-practiced limits. And for a while, I missed that ease. But I noticed something. The discomfort didn't weaken me. It clarified me. I began to feel engaged again. Not excited in a loud way, but present in a grounded one. Days had texture. Conversations had weight. Even frustration felt honest. I wasn't happier. I was more awake. Some choices backfired. Some risks led nowhere. I had moments where I questioned whether abandoning ease was worth the cost. There were days when I longed for the predictability I had left behind. But even then, something fundamental had changed. I was choosing. Regret shifted again. It stopped pointing backward and started orienting forward. It became less about what I had lost and more about what I was no longer willing to lose. Time. I stopped measuring my life by how smoothly it ran and started measuring it by how much of myself was present inside it. I stopped asking whether something was safe and started asking whether it was honest. That didn't make decisions easier. It made them meaningful. The easier version of me didn't disappear. It still shows up, offering shortcuts, suggesting restraint, reminding me of how comfortable things could be. But now, it's no longer in charge. I understand something now that took me years to learn. Ease is not a reward. It's a byproduct. And when you make it your primary goal, it quietly replaces purpose. I don't hate the version of me who chose ease. That person was protecting themselves with the tools they had. But I no longer let that version make my decisions. Because I've felt the cost of living small. I've felt the weight of years that passed without resistance, without friction, without growth. I know how dangerous it is to confuse comfort with contentment. If you're listening to this and you feel that pull toward the easier choice, the one that asks less of you, demands less from you, keeps you safely recognizable, I won't tell you to reject it completely. But I will ask you to notice something. What part of you are you protecting by choosing ease? And what part of you are you slowly abandoning? I chose the easier version of myself for a long time. It kept me safe. It kept me liked. It kept my life intact. And it almost kept me from ever fully living it. Choosing the harder version of myself didn't give me certainty. It gave me presence. And presence, imperfect, uncomfortable, earned presence, was the second chance I didn't realize I still had.